So let me just call this up here. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to the Ecology graduate students for the very flattering invitation. In all sincerity, I had a look at the list of speakers that have been invited this year, and I was like, okay, clearly they want the thing to go uphill as they go along because I'm leading off. And then they've got people like Bob Holt and Diana Wall and Hope Jaren, like all these great people. I'm like, can I come back, once a month and listen, to these people? Because it's a terrific series. And so I'm very flattered to be invited. And thank you in particular to Lisa and Ashley for hosting me. Having been a seminar host myself, I know how much, how much work that is. So my talk today is going to be a little bit unconventional because I need to use an old form of scholarly communication, a lecture, to tell you about a newer form, blogs. And I struggled a bit with how to do that, and so let me illustrate why. So just by show of hands, how many of you read papers in scientific journals? Okay. And how many of you write papers for scientific journals? Okay, most hands still up. And how many of you attend scientific conferences? Right, most everybody in the room. Now, how many of you read scholarly blogs? Blogs written by and aimed at people in your field? Fewer hands. And now I'll make almost every hand go down. How many of you write blogs? Okay. So you see what I mean here. Blogs as a means of scholarly communication are a little bit over 10 years old. So we're in a time of transition right now, I think, where there are some scholars in ecology and in all fields who spend a lot of their time reading blogs and even writing them themselves sometimes. And there are other people who don't read blogs at all and maybe in some cases don't even see really any value in them, don't like them. And so it's kind of a broad audience. And any talk to a broad audience is kind of difficult. So here's my solution. I've structured the talk like a series of blog posts. So there's not be kind of any one narrative thread that sort of runs through the entire talk. Instead, I'm going to give you a series of vignettes, each of which makes what I hope will be an interesting point about blogs as a means of scholarly communication. And so if you don't like one vignette, well, that's OK. Like a good blog, another one will be along soon enough, as it were. Another post will be along soon enough. And the other thing I'll say before I begin is that there are many ways in which blogs can be used. I'm only going to be talking about one of them. Blogs as a means for scholars to communicate with one another, as opposed to like public outreach or whatever. And that's purely because this is the only use of blogs with which I have any personal experience. Oh, and I should, there's a clicker here. So. Okay, and that may have like booted itself out or something like that. So what we'll do is just do it the old school way. Okay. So let me just make sure everyone's on the same page. I'll start with a little potted history of blogs. And this is like according to Wikipedia here. So if you don't know, a blog is just a website where one or more authors, called bloggers, post pieces of their writing for anyone to read and usually publicly comment on. So it's the unedited voice of the author or authors, which, as I'll discuss later, can be a good thing and a bad thing. Before blogs existed, there were other ways for people with shared interests to kind of communicate with one another online, things like Usenet or bulletin board services, email lists. Some of those things still exist, right? You can think of the Ecolog email list in ecology or EvilDir in evolutionary biology. In 1994, the advent of the first web browser led to people starting online diaries. Apparently, an undergrad at Swarthmore is credited with being the first person to do this. And in 1997, the term weblog was coined for that activity, later shortened to blog. And in 1999, Blogger.com and other websites made online publishing sort of technically easy for the first time. Previously, you had to know how to code HTML to make and maintain your own website. So now that the technical obstacles were removed, blogging really kind of took off. A lot of the most popular bloggers then and now were commentators on news, politics, and popular culture. But scientists also took up blogging fairly early on. The oldest science blogs are over 10 years old. So I'll start with a bit of personal history. I got into blogging by accident. Okay. So just to preface this, because I'm actually old school. Okay, blogging is the only thing I do with my time that my PhD supervisor doesn't do with his time. I'm old enough to have used, or at least in the case of CompuServe, well remember all of these things. For instance, like email only became in widespread use late in my undergraduate career, and I used to check my email on a command line interface called Telnet. And for the grad students in the audience, and I also had to walk 10 miles through the snow to school, and it was uphill both ways, and you kids should get off my lawn. The point here is that for me, blogging is not some radically new thing. For me, it's just a better way to do certain traditional things ecologists and people in other fields have always done. Okay, and that'll be a theme kind of running through the talk. So here's how I got into blogging. Back in 2011, I was an editor for the journal Oikos. And so Chris Lordy, one of the senior editors, announced to us one day that the journal would be starting a blog. And the idea was that it would be a place where all the editors would post their interesting thoughts in ecology, which would attract readers in their own right, and would also kind of rub off on the journal and kind of enhance the journal's reputation so that authors would want to submit their best stuff to the journal. And I thought that was a neat idea. At the time, I was reading some blogs, although actually not science blogs. I mostly sort of read economics and politics blogs. And so I knew what blogs were, and I saw value in them. And I also wanted to do my bit to help out the journal. And so I decided to try it out. And so I started posting. This is a screenshot of my first post. And I quickly found that I liked doing it. And it didn't take a lot of my time, at least not more than I was prepared to give, because I do write fairly quickly. And we started to attract an audience, and they were very positive too. I got positive feedback, for instance, from Ethan early on, who's been blogging for longer than I have. And that was important to me. There certainly are people who are happy to just post stuff on the internet on the off chance that anyone wants to read it, but who aren't bothered if nobody does, which is fine. There's no one right way to blog. That's just not me. It was important to me that we had an audience. Not because an audience is valuable for its own sake. It's not like I'm doing this to get famous, and it's not like whoever dies with the most page views wins. It's that I'm an academic, right? I care about ideas. I want to talk about ideas, often quite obscure ideas, with other people who share my interests, and I want to see good ideas win out over bad ideas. And none of those things can happen if you're just talking to yourself. Okay, so but none of the other editors were really posting with any regularity, which is, again, was fine. I definitely don't think everybody should blog. Okay, but it meant that Oikos blog was pretty much my show, which was, I think, unfortunate given the original goals of the blog, but which was fortunate for me. I was very lucky. Chris Lordy and the other senior editors basically let me write whatever I wanted with no editorial oversight, and I hope that I justified that trust. And I'm sure the fact that, and even though I wasn't subject to any sort of editorial oversight, I'm sure the fact that it was Oikos' name on the masthead gave me credibility with at least some readers that I would have struggled perhaps to earn on my own. But eventually it became time to just part ways. I found myself increasingly wanting to write about things that just had no connection to the journal. Previously I tried to always make some kind of tangential connection to the journal in all my posts for the most part. And I wanted to do some things that I couldn't do because it wasn't my blog. And so in, this works good. So in summer of 2012, I left Oikos blog and I started my own blog, Dynamic Ecology. And so the first thing I did was I made it a group blog. So as Peter mentioned, I invited on board actually 3 colleagues whom I had reason to think would want to blog and would be good at it. And 2 of them have decided to stick with it, Brian McGill and Megan Duffy. They are both awesome, okay? Inviting them on board is probably the best professional decision I've ever made. And Dynamic Ecology, I would say, is probably now my best collaboration. It is a true collaborative effort. And the blog, I know some people I tend to identify the blog with me just because I do post a bit more often than Brian and Megan, and because I founded it. But really, it is a collaborative effort. We all agree on how it's will be run. It belongs to all 3 of us, and it's much, much better than anything I ever would have produced on my own. And the other sort of anecdote I'll throw in is that I'm now proud to count Brian and Megan as good friends, and that wasn't the case before. I actually didn't even know them. I hadn't even met them before I invited them onto the blog. I've gotten to know them through the blog, and it's been great. And we also do some invited guest posts, including actually from Peter Adler, who's here, and we have lots and lots of commenters, and they're great, and that's something I'll come back to. And I also say, just as an aside, like everything I say in this talk this is coming from me. I'm not speaking on behalf of Brian and Meg. They can speak for themselves. So at the risk of tooting my own horn, I'll just give you a quick sort of numerical snapshot of our vital signs, as it were. So we've done, actually this has gone up now since Brian posted this week. We've done just over 930 posts all time. We do about 20 posts per month, pretty regularly. We get about, depending on the month, between 35,000 and 50,000 page views per month, more than 750,000 all time. Those views come from something between, again, depending on the month, 18,000 to 26,000 unique visitors. Not everybody visits as regularly, so there's probably a core of several hundred to maybe 1,000 sort of human beings who sort of read us very regularly, like sort of read everything, and then larger numbers of people who read more occasionally, read certain posts or whatever, depending on their interests. About half the unique visitors are from the US. We're very proud that we got a lot of comments. We have over 10,000 comments all time. And by the way, the comments are moderated. I've literally only ever had to block about a dozen comments for being offensive or otherwise out of line. So if you have a view of like the internet as a place where like uninformed jerks like say uninformed jerkish things to each other, not on Dynamic Ecology. And I hope it never changes. Our commenters are awesome. If you're not reading the comments, you're really missing out. And the readership is still growing, actually, with no sign of slowing down. I mean, I'm sure it will slow down at some point, but I do think we have a lot of room to grow. There certainly are. I mean, for as many people as read us, there are a lot of ecologists who don't read us and don't even know we exist. So I do think there is a lot of room to grow. Enough about Dynamic Ecology for the moment. I'll come back to like what we write about. But first, I want to kind of step back, take a broader overview of the terrain. And like any good blogger, I'm going to start by asking a deliberately provocative question. Are blogs dying? Now, Dynamic Ecology is not dead yet, as I just showed you, as the Monty Python catchphrase goes. But maybe we're the exception. Okay, that's a deliberately provocative question, but it's not a stupid question, okay? Because at least by some lines of evidence, blogs peaked years ago, okay? So these are time series data on weekly Google searches on the term blog. And by this one measure, blogs peaked 5 years ago. And interest in them as relative to all other things people could be interested in has been declining ever since. Same is true for searches on the term science blog. Peaked back in 2009, okay? And now, correlations and causation, but I think part of what's going on here is that some roles that blogs previously sort of maybe used to play have been superseded by other forms of sort of online communication. In particular, in 2009 is when Twitter took off, right? So Twitter is a way for people to quickly share very short items, right? A single sentence, a single link, a single picture, or whatever, which is something a lot of people, scientists and non-scientists, want to do. Right? Many more than want to read blogs, and certainly more than want to write blogs. Okay? So by the way, speaking of things that people want to do, here's the same graph with searches on Facebook included. What people really want to do is, right, what people mostly want to do, including scientists, is talk to their friends. A blog is a way of talking to anyone, which many fewer people want to do. And there are other anecdotes you can find. Back in 2007, the publishers of the journal Nature started a blogging network. They started hosting a bunch of blogs. It was called the Nature Network. It grew, and then it died. In 2013, they shut it down. Popular Science magazine recently shut off online commenting on their articles because they found the comments were of low quality and subtracted more value than they added. Within Ecology, I've noticed sort of informally that at least some, not all, but some established ecology blogs actually have started to fade away or have faded away. They're posting much less often than they used to. So here's what I think is going on. Look, blogs are not dying, but I think there has been a shakeout. I think we've passed the stage where blogs were a new thing and people were really excited about them, maybe got overexcited about them. And now people, I think, have increasingly realized what blogs are good for and what you have to do to have a good one. And so if you like, we kind of went through an exponential growth phase and sort of overshot carrying capacity a bit. And now blogs are kind of settling back down into some sort of quasi-equilibrium as like a stable part of the scientific communication ecosystem. So what part of the ecosystem is that? What is the blogging niche? I've illustrated this with a little passage from Dr. Seuss's On Beyond Zebra that proves that Dr. Seuss was a community ecologist. Do people know about this passage, by the way? Like this, I learned about this from an old paper of Simon Levin's that quotes it in an appendix. So so On Beyond Zebra, so this is total aside. So I'll show off my knowledge of Dr. Seuss. On Beyond Zebra is this book about all the letters of the alphabet beyond the letter Z that come after that. And there's one passage which is like, it's like the perfect little community ecology ditty. And nut is the letter I use to spell nutches, who live in small caves, known as niches for hutches. These nutches have troubles, the biggest of which is the fact there are many more nutches than niches. Each nutch in a niche knows that some other nutch would like to move into his niche very much. So each nutch in a niche has to watch that small niche, or nutches who haven't got niches will snitch. Back to our regularly scheduled talk here. So I'm going to show you an overly complicated graph. I'm going to plot various forms of science communication in a four-dimensional space, on four niche axes if you like. So on the x-axis here, I'm going to arrange them from informal to formal modes of communication. On the y-axis, from private or closed modes to more public or open modes of communication. And since I've run out of two physical dimensions, I'll have to indicate the other two with symbols. So the arrows, I'll use two-headed or single-headed arrows to indicate two-way versus one-way communication. So one-way being more like a broadcast, two-way being more like a conversation. And the arrow colors indicate whether a mode of communication is sort of slow in white or very fast in blue. So scientific papers and books, for instance, are our most formal means of communicating with one another. These are very formal documents. They're vetted by a peer review system, right? They're fairly public and open on the y-axis, although you might have to, of course, pay for access. And they're one way from author to reader, and they can be quite slow. A scientific paper or book can take a very long time to produce and be vetted. And without belaboring, because I think it's pretty obvious, here's about where I think something like talks or posters would fit, and here's where something like conversations or email would fit. Newer forms of communication occupy different regions of the niche space. So, for instance, online preprints, so unreviewed manuscripts that people just post online to get feedback on, are similar to papers or books, except they're a bit more public and open, and perhaps a bit faster to produce. Social media, things like Twitter and Facebook, are very much like conversations and email, except that they're much more public and open. And here's where I think blogs fit. The level of formality is maybe roughly similar, or can be roughly similar to like a talk or a poster. But they're much more public and open. Anybody can read a blog. They are or can be a two-way form of communication, back and forth between authors and commenters. And they're very quick to write. The point of this slide is that blogs are not a replacement or a substitute for other means of scholarly communication. They're a complement. Okay, different modes of communication, right, are best for different purposes. And so I think that blogs are better than other forms of communication for certain purposes that scholars have always wanted to engage in. So, and to illustrate that, I'm going to talk to you for a couple of minutes about blogs from before there were blogs. Okay. So when I started at Dynamic Ecology, my mental model of how to be a blogger was actually not other bloggers. It was this, John Lawton's View from the Park. So in the mid-1990s, for those of you who don't know, John Lawton, who's now retired, he was one of the world's leading community ecologists at the time, had a column in Oikos called View from the Park, in which John would, so these papers were kind of short opinion pieces or editorials or essays, where John would just sort of give his thoughts on ecology. And they were great. Several of them have become minor classics. They've been cited hundreds of times. I devoured these things as a graduate student, and so did Brian McGill, actually. And like one of them that I remember in particular, for instance, John argued that we should give up on doing community ecology. Okay, which, by the way, was his own field, because it was too idiosyncratic. It was just a stamp collection of special cases. It was time to just stop it. And one of my first blog posts for Oikos was my own response to this piece of John's. Now, clearly, these weren't conventional scientific papers, but nevertheless, they were definitely talking about things that we as scientists need to think about. Not everything that is worth thinking and talking about is the sort of thing that you would report in a conventional scientific paper. Okay? And there are other examples. Like before John, like Dan Jansen, for instance, tropical ecologist, had a column in Oikos actually in the mid-1980s. You can also think of the example of opinion and perspective pieces. We've always had a place for these in science, right? So, because a lot of doing science, as much as we like to think of it as sort of objective, we all know, really, that a lot of doing science involves making judgment calls about what questions are most worth asking and how do we go about answering them. Those judgment calls are not completely objective, like whether 2 + 2 = 4, whether bacteria are smaller than whales, right? But neither are they completely subjective, like a preference for chocolate ice cream over vanilla. Right? Rather, we need a space for professionals to explain their own judgments to each other on grounds that other professionals can appreciate, if not necessarily agree with, right? And I've even done this myself, actually. So I wrote a paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution last year that argues that a very important hypothesis in ecology, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, should be abandoned. And this paper, by the way, actually grew out of a series of blog posts I did. I never would have written that paper had I not been blogging, and that's something I'll come back to. There's also always been a place in the scientific literature for humor and satire and rhetoric. Now, a very small place, right? Only a very small fraction of papers and books employ these devices. But you can argue that they're actually a very influential fraction. My favorite example, and I could have picked more examples, but my favorite example of these is actually this 1983 American Naturalist paper by Norm Elstrand posing the question, why are juveniles smaller than their parents? It's basically a subtler, funnier version of Gould and Lewitton's Spandrels of San Marco attacking sort of adaptationism. Now, of course, these things have been, these devices are controversial. There are a lot of people who would argue that, look, as a scientist, you should always write in a dry, sober, measured style, right? And there are good reasons for doing that, not least of which is that is, in fact, the way most people write and the way most people expect you to write. Back when scientific papers were first sort of being invented at the Royal Society of London in the 17th century, there was actually debate as to what style was appropriate for them. I would argue that there are times when a dry style is not, the best thing, right? For instance, one common thread with a lot of these examples is that a lot of them were people arguing against some widely held view, and so in order to even, to get the reader's attention and even get a hearing, in order to get people to sort of sit up and take notice and take them seriously, they had to employ some attention-grabbing style, right? And other times they were just being playful, which I think is fine as well. And finally, there's always been a place for discussion and debate in the scientific literature. We don't all agree with each other, okay? We don't. And so we need a place to talk about those disagreements. So you can think of like invited, special sections in journals sometimes where people present, different views on some controversial topic, and also, of course, like technical comments on papers. Blogs can do all those things. In many cases, better than journals can. Here's a data culture reference. It's like the $6 Million Man TV show. We have the technology. We can make scientific communication better, stronger, faster. Unfortunately, our blogs aren't accompanied by the little sound effect like that accompanied the $6 Million Man whenever he did anything exceptional. So I'll illustrate that by talking about some of the things we've done with dynamic ecology. So let me just talk about some of our most popular posts and the range of things we write about. So our second most popular post of all time is one I wrote. It's called E.O. Wilson versus Math. So this is something I wrote in response to an editorial that Wilson wrote in the Wall Street Journal, in which he argued that math is an unimportant and purely technical exercise. And if you, as a budding biological researcher, want to make a big impact in the field and you don't know much math, and you struggle with math, no problem. You can simply find an area of research where you can make a big impact without having to do math. I strongly disagree with this. I was kind of dismayed and mystified that Wilson wrote this, and I explained why in no uncertain terms. And I must have struck a nerve because this post became kind of central to a wide-ranging online debate involving academics and students from all over the world talking about the place of mathematics in science, how we teach mathematics and how we can teach it better, and much more besides. I really learned a lot from it. Our most popular post all time, though, by a landslide, is very different. It's by Meg, and it dispels the myth that you have to work 80 hours a week to succeed in academia. And also, by the way, dispels the myth that academics actually do work 80 hours a week. You may think you do. Track your time, okay? And make sure you subtract out going for coffee and going for lunch and checking the news and checking Facebook and kind of sort of thinking about science while you're watching TV, okay? Right? You don't work 80 hours a week. Okay, nobody does. You don't even get close, all right? The blog is also a place where we can tell personal stories sometimes, when those stories would be of value to our fellow ecologists. So for instance, both Meg and I almost quit. Meg in the middle of grad school and me at the end of my postdoc. And so because a blog is kind of a less formal venue, it's a place where you can talk about these sorts of personal things, which is value of people who are going through the same experience and who maybe think, that they're alone, that they're the only ones, and they're not. We do a lot of advice posts. This is actually a fair bit of what we do, and those are often our most enduringly popular posts. So as one example, Meg has a sort of curated collection of videos that are useful for teaching ecology that she's compiled from suggestions sent in by readers, and she updates as readers send her more suggestions. So if you have a video you use in your classes that's great for teaching something about ecology, send it to Meg, and she will add it to the post. And it's organized with oh, you want to teach population dynamics or whatever, here's some videos, right? As a different example of advice, I have an enduringly popular post on how to suggest referees in your cover letter to the journal editor. Now, this is a very, very small thing, right? But I guess precisely because it is a small thing, it's not something a lot of students get taught how to do because they're all coming to this post, apparently, to find out how to do it. And finally, this last one is actually only a fairly small fraction of what we do, but I think people tend to think we do it a lot because it attracts the most attention. So sometimes we do posts talking about, and yes, even sometimes criticizing how we and others sort of do science. So for instance, Brian has an ongoing series of posts, the latest one was just earlier this week, on what he calls statistical machismo, the worrying tendency for researchers to use overly complicated statistical methods without properly weighing the costs and benefits. For instance, the example he's been debating lately, Brian has argued that in a lot of, in wildlife ecology and a lot of other fields, estimating detection probabilities is actually either not worth it on balance and might even be unjustified just on purely statistical grounds, okay? when he wrote this is, of course, a very controversial thing to say, and it sparked a great debate in the comments between Brian and leading wildlife ecologists and leading statisticians and experts from other fields, and it was really, I thought it was really effective and productive. There was very quick back and forth, rather than this thing taking sort of months or years to play out. Anybody could participate, not just the few, privileged few who were invited to participate by a journal, say, or something like that. And far from lowering the tone of that debate or just becoming a free-for-all because anybody can jump in fact, I think it actually raised the tone and improved the debate and broadened the range of perspectives that were included. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what's kind of become our, for better or for worse, our sort of most well-known meme, I think. Zombie, this is a creation of mine, zombie ideas in ecology. So if you haven't heard this, the short version is that zombie ideas are widely held ideas that should be dead, but aren't. They're undead ideas that just lurch on despite sort of repeated, empirical and theoretical refutations, continue to eat the brains of new, generations of ecologists. And this is my own sort of best attempt at using sort of humor and rhetoric to call attention to what I do think is a sort of a serious issue. And through doing it, I've learned a lot about sort of science, about blogging, and about myself, honestly. And so I thought I'd spend a few minutes sort of talking about that. So pulling back the curtain and sort of thinking about zombie as a zombie thinker here, thinking about zombie ideas in ecology from my perspective. Just by way of scientific background. So the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, if you're not aware, is the term was originally coined by Joe Connell in a 1978 science paper, although others before him had similar ideas. This is the idea that species diversity is, or should be, a humped function of disturbance frequency or intensity. So disturbances here could be anything from like footfalls to things like wildfires or hurricanes, right? This is a very important and hugely influential idea in ecology. It's, I think, for various reasons. It is very intuitive. If you're not familiar with it, like, take my word for it. It really does seem like this should be generally true. Okay. Some now very famous early studies did indeed find the predicted pattern. So some of the first times people went out and looked, they did indeed find what Connell had predicted. And so it spawned a lot of research, and it's now in all the textbooks. Okay. It's a standard textbook idea. It's mostly wrong. Okay. And I say that in full knowledge that probably a lot of people sitting in this audience totally disagree with me on that. All I can say is, like, right, as academics, we've got to be honest. We've got to call them like I see them. This is how I see this one. All right. On the empirical side, less than 20% of empirical studies find the predicted hump pattern, and the track record is pretty much almost that bad if you just restrict attention to controlled experiments. On the theoretical side, 3 of the main mechanisms proposed to why you should expect that hump pattern are actually logically invalid. By which I mean their assumptions or premises do not actually imply the predictions they are widely thought to imply. They're actually non sequiturs. The world literally cannot work as these mechanisms say the world should work. It's impossible. Okay? There are other mechanisms that can work, but the trouble is that models of them actually often don't predict the humped pattern. So none of these points, I want to emphasize, none of these points are original to me. Okay, all of them have been made previously in the literature, in papers, in leading journals. In fact, one of my favorite papers of all time makes some of these points. It's actually by Nancy Huntley, the Ecology Center director, along with Peter Chess and Huntley, 1997, is fantastic. But these papers, for whatever reason, haven't really been sort of widely noted or taken on board, I don't think. And that bugged me. Science is supposed to be this progressive, self-correcting thing, right? But this seemed like a case where, for whatever reason, we'd kind of gotten stuck. And like somehow an early version, and I should say here as well, because I think through my own fault, through the way I wrote these posts, people have gotten a mistaken impression. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis is not a bad idea. Okay, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis was a good idea. Okay, Joe Connell is a great ecologist, and his original verbal idea was well worth exploring theoretically and empirically. It deserved the influence it had. I just felt like, as ecologists, we had explored it theoretically and empirically, and we'd found it wanting. Okay, and there's no shame in that. That happens to a lot of ideas in science. It certainly happens to my own ideas about how my own systems work. But yet somehow we hadn't really sort of moved on. And so I wrote a post on the Oikos blog trying to make these points in an accessible and non-technical way. And to make it entertaining so that people would actually read it, I dressed it up in silly zombie jokes. And it was supposed to be silly, it was supposed to be sort of fun, not like threatening or whatever. Like the only zombie movie I've actually ever even seen is Army of Darkness, which is it's like a self-aware, like funny zombie movie. So it was supposed to be like Army of Darkness, like it was supposed to be funny. Actually, I stole the term from, and the term zombie ideas is not original to me either. I stole the term from the title of an economics book, Zombie Economics by John Quiggle. He didn't coin it either. I think he got it from a guy named Paul Krugman. It became sort of a meme, like it became sort of, so I have written about other ideas that in my view are zombie ideas. Like this is a silly picture I posted to the blog of me posing as a zombie slayer. And now other people have started to pick up on it. Like this is Luke Harmon, this is a poor picture, but it's a picture of Luke Harmon giving a talk at the recent American Society of Naturalists meeting in January. And he talked about zombie ideas in his talk. And now like Peter Abrams actually has a paper in press, like a paper in which he cites the blog and talks about like zombie ideas. So it's kind of like taking off a little. And so I want to sort of reflect on this a little bit. I think the zombie ideas thing has worked out sort of on balance overall. It's been a good thing. I think I'm kind of lucky that it was and looking back, I didn't think about it originally as much as I should have. And so I wanted to kind of talk about that a bit. The zombie ideas thing, it reflects my, writing this thing in part reflects my background. As I said, like when I started blogging, I was reading a lot of economics blogs, and at least in certain parts of the economics blogosphere, no-holds-barred debate and snarky humor are sort of very much, the norm, or at least they're common. And I think I didn't think through as much as I should have the fact that they weren't common in ecology, either within or outside the blogosphere. And so I've since learned, like as a blogger, you have to be your own editor, right? And I've since learned to be a little more circumspect about just posting whatever pops into my head. It also reflects my personality. I mean, I like a good argument. I'm opinionated, and yeah, I have a snarky sense of humor. And I like the fact that blogging, because it's this more informal space, right, is a space where I can let that side of myself come out, and some readers do find it, entertaining. I do think the blog would be boring if I totally, tried to suppress that. But it's also very off-putting. It is very off-putting for some readers, and that's something I struggle with. There is no pleasing everybody, but that doesn't necessarily mean that just any way of writing is equally good. I think looking back, especially in the early days in the Oikos blog, and also in the early days on dynamic ecology, I think I've gotten better in the past year. I think I was kind of went too far towards like letting the sort of opinionated, aggressive, snarky side of me kind of come out. And I have made a conscious effort to kind of dial back, and I think it's better. I don't know. I actually don't really know if readers have noticed the difference or not, but I am sort of trying to find an optimal, sort of balance. Try to put the best part of me out and not like the worst part of like, oh, after I've had 3 beers, part of me. Yeah, let's sort of talk about that. It also has, I do think, about the other thing about I want to talk about sort of my way of writing. I've learned that I have a lot to learn about writing to persuade. And inviting Brian and Meg on board actually taught me that. Brian in particular, is amazing at because he also writes sort of critical things sometimes, but he writes them in such a way such that they kind of come off very positive. He and I have occasionally written posts making the exact same point, and my posts at best get sort of grudging like agreement through gritted teeth, and like, I guess you have a point. And his have the same readers like happily nodding along, like, oh yeah, of course. And he's amazing. I don't know how he does it. And Meg's great too, in particular about writing about sort of sensitive topics in a way that where she's really is saying something substantial, but yet somehow doesn't sort of offend anyone. She's amazing as well. I have a lot to learn from both of them. It shaped my view on blogs, because as I say, I do think it's worked out in a positive way overall, and I think it does, the zombie ideas thing does illustrate the value of having a space where scientists can be a little bit more playful and say, okay, here's what I really think. I do think there is value of that, and that the zombie ideas thing kind of illustrates that. And it's, like I say, also shaped my views on how we do science. I do think criticism has an important role to play in science. I don't think science progresses as fast as it could if nobody criticizes it and you just sort of vote with your feet and ignore the things you don't agree with or don't like. I think science actually progresses faster if we are willing to be a little more critical with each other. Although, of course, it's important that we do that in effective ways, all I can say is that I hope dynamic ecology is, we're trying our best to sort of lead by example and show, like, okay, what can effective criticism, other than at the pre-publication peer review stage, right, where it's the one place where it kind of happens regularly. What can discussion and debate, and more broadly, just all forms of scholarly communication look like in the online age? What can we do with blogs to make ecology better? I hope dynamic ecology is leading by example on that. And just to sort of talk about that a little bit more, about how blogs can sort of be influential and kind of shape the direction of the field. I used to think, like when I wrote the zombie ideas post, I used to think of each post as kind of its own separate entity. Like in this post, I will make a point, right? Each post is its own separate thing. I don't think that anymore. I think of the blog more as a body of work. And so it's not that I don't care if an individual post is good or not. I certainly do want them all to be good. But I think it's the shooting match, not the individual shot, that really counts. Because look, even if an individual post goes viral, like frankly, it's not going to be read by more than a small fraction of the global audience that might, benefit from reading it, and it's not going to have that much effect on that many people. Honestly, one post is not going to change anybody's life, like scientific or non-scientific life, right? But blogs scale, right? You can reach a lot of people and reach them repeatedly. And so cumulatively over time, right, if people are reading you, you're collectively giving a lot of little nudges to a lot of people to kind of, think about the things you think about and maybe think about them the way you think about them. And hopefully the cumulative effect of that is large. It's like the Aesop's fable about the pitcher and the crow, right, where the pitcher can't reach, the crow can't reach the liquid in the bottom of the pitcher. And so by adding small pebbles one after another, the level of the water eventually gets lifted to where the crow can take a drink. I think that's what you're doing as a blogger. The only difference being that you can't really sort of judge the level of the water, as it were, how much sort of influence you're having. All you can do is like throw pebbles in there as best you can and sort of hope for the best. Those are very tentative thoughts on the influence of blogs. I don't know if they're right. I certainly know there are lots of people who wouldn't agree with them. I mean, for instance, we have had occasionally folks have commented on the blog to the effect that they think we're really influential, that dynamic ecology, like by putting up one single post, can change the direction of the entire field. Can like cause, for instance, if we call something a zombie idea, that's just going to shut down the entire research program. Okay, they're laughing. I don't agree either, but I mean, there are readers who are, who seriously think that. And on the other side, I'm sure there are lots of comments we don't get from readers who don't think we're influential at all because they don't read us and probably don't even know we exist. So, and I mean, how do you measure influence, right? What are you even trying to measure, right? So I don't know how to put, numbers on it. All you do is you do the best you can. Finally, I'll close with a few thoughts on sort of the the future of blogging from my perspective, and maybe also give a little bit of advice from the front lines for anybody who's thinking about blogging themselves. So here's a space for time substitution. One possible vision of the future of ecology blogs is the present of economics blogs. Economists, for various reasons, have taken up blogging more enthusiastically, I think, than any other scholarly field. And so anybody who's anybody in economics has a blog, okay? And there really is a profession-wide conversation online. There's a lot of back and forth between different blogs and also via preprints, which economists use very heavily. And journals still exist and actually are important in economics, but they're important more as a way of kind of enshrining the results of online discussions that have already been going on for some considerable period of time before the paper was published. So that's one possible vision of the future. The whole thing's kind of a bit Clementsian, if you like. There's a blogosphere, a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Ecology is not like that. I actually don't think it will be. Ecology just has blogs. There are individual ecology blogs, each of which kind of starts its own conversations, but each ecology blogger mostly writes about their own stuff. And for the most part, we tend not to take that much notice of each other. I mean, there isn't a lot, occasionally, but there's not a lot of sort of continuous back and forth between us. I actually think that's fine, or it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just the way it is, and I don't know that we can or should sort of try to change it. How are you going to force more people to blog, right? Yeah, it's just a difference between the fields, and I think it will continue to be that way. So there certainly are good blogs written by ecologists, and also good ecology blogs, and also good blogs written by ecologists about other things, and I've highlighted both of those sorts of blogs here. But each of them is kind of its own thing and sort of starts its own conversations. It's very sort of Gleasonian, if you like. So finally, I'll close with sort of a bit of advice, should you blog? Maybe you're inspired by this talk to make your own zombie jokes or whatever it is. Should you do it? Well, here's some advice. The short answer is probably not. And I say that just because statistically, most people don't do it, right? And statistically, you're probably like most people, right? That's unhelpful, so here's a longer answer. Ask yourself the following questions. So don't get into it by accident the way I did. Ask yourself the following questions. Think about it. What you're going to, why do you want to do it and how? So why do you want to blog? There's lots of reasons to do it. My reasons, to influence the direction of my field, are only one among many. You could do it for outreach or to influence policy or for all kinds of other reasons. Do it for a good reason. And there are also bad reasons to do it, right? Don't do it because you want to get famous or because because this is one I've heard before, it'll force me to get some practice writing. No, it won't. It's not a commitment device, okay? Wanting to write causes you to have a blog. Having a blog does not cause you to want to write, okay? It doesn't work. Do you care if anyone reads it? The internet is not a democracy, okay? And just because in principle anything can be shared, anything can go viral, does not mean that in practice everything is equally likely to go viral, okay? The distribution of attention paid to anything, actually online or offline, blogs, music, movies, scientific papers, anything, is very highly skewed and always has been. A very small fraction of things get a very large fraction of the collective world's attention. Most things get no attention at all, okay? So if you want an audience, you're probably going to have to post a lot and keep it up for months. Not necessarily, but probably. You're going to have to do other things well, and you're going to have to get lucky, okay? Do you really want to do it? By which I mean, right, because there's always other things you could be doing, right? If you find yourself wanting to blog when you're doing those other things, and sometimes you give in to that temptation, you'll be a good blogger, I think. And that needn't destroy your productivity doing other things. And here's the secret to that. I procrastinate, just like you do, okay? But the difference is I like blogging, and so blogging is how I procrastinate. And so I get something out of the time I spend procrastinating. That's what it is. do you have something to say? And in particular, something to say that no one else is saying. I think, particularly if you do want to build an audience, I think one effective strategy is to kind of specialize on something that you're passionate about and that you know a lot about. Peter's very flattering remarks aside, dynamic ecology is actually really narrow in a lot of ways. Both my own posts and the three of us collectively, it's each of us just posting on whatever we feel like posting on. There's definitely no attempt made for dynamic ecology to be a comprehensive ecology blog. There's all kinds of hugely important, interesting stuff that we do not talk about just because we don't feel like it, okay? So I would say we're actually quite specialized, and I think that's the way to go. How well and how quickly do you write? I write pretty quickly, and I'm comfortable writing for a in a conversational sort of style, and what I hope is engaging. If you struggle to write, or if the only thing you're comfortable writing are technical scientific papers, you're going to struggle as a blogger. Okay, although you'll of course get better with practice. How self-confident are you? Both too little and too much self-confidence are bad. Okay, too little self-confidence, and you'll never post anything that's worth saying. Okay, too much, and you'll eventually post something you regret, and I've done that. There's an optimal level of fear, and it's an intermediate level.
Kind of a hump function.
Yeah. I didn't say there were no hump functions in ecology. I just said that wasn't one. Are there others who want to do it with you? Okay, it's a lot easier to keep up a high frequency of posting if you have a little team doing it. And you can also, again, cover maybe a broader range of things. Can you live offline with whatever you plan to say online? Because you're going to have to. Okay, there's no erasing anything from the internet. Now, of course, one way to deal with this is to blog under a pseudonym, which is a whole nother topic on which people have very strong and conflicting opinions. My own opinion is that there are very good reasons to blog under a pseudonym and very good reasons not to. And you need to decide which reasons apply to you. And the other thing to say about this is that, right, even if people don't read your blog, just the fact that they know you have a blog or they've heard you have a blog may shape their views of you, and you have to be comfortable with that. Which kind of gets to the last point. Do people whose opinions you care about support it? In particular, your supervisor or employer. I had tenure when I started blogging. So did Brian. Meg didn't, but she was close, and she was a slam dunk for tenure anyway. Not that you necessarily have to. I mean, a lot of the blogs I showed you earlier, for instance, are written by graduate students or postdocs or things. So I do think it's actually is possible to overrate kind of like the potential risk to your career or whatever if you blog. But it is also possible to underrate it. I mean, my head of department, for instance, likes that I blog. In particular because I can show him that lots of people read it. But even if lots of people didn't, he wouldn't mind as long as it didn't interfere with me, doing the other things I'm supposed to do as a professor. But if your supervisor, like your employer, like didn't want you doing it, like thought it was a waste of time and took you away from other things you should be doing, yeah, you are gonna have to find a way to to deal with that. And again, of course, one way to do that is to blog under a pseudonym, which we could talk about afterwards if anyone's interested. That's as much as I had. Hopefully this talk was not the sort of talk equivalent of too long didn't read. So thanks for listening. I'll be happy to take questions.
We have time for a few questions before heading to the session.